The morning sun cast long shadows across Willowbrook Commons when Karen Richardson raised her designer heel and brought it down with devastating precision. The small medical device shattered against the concrete walkway, its electronic components scattering like digital confetti across the pristine sidewalk. She stood there for a moment, surveying her handiwork with the satisfaction of someone who had just eliminated a particularly annoying mosquito. Tommy Morrison, 8 years old and confined to his wheelchair, stared at the remains of his emergency alert bracelet with eyes that had seen too much disappointment for his age. The device had been his lifeline, his connection to help when his muscular dystrophy episodes became too severe for his small body to handle alone. Now it lay in pieces, victim to the whims of a woman who found its intermittent beeping inconvenient to her morning yoga routine. "Problem solved," Karen announced, brushing imaginary dust from her manicured hands. That horrible noise was disturbing Princess's meditation sessions. Some of us actually care about our pets' well-being. Sarah Morrison rushed from her front door, her nurse's scrubs still bearing traces of her overnight shift at the Children's Hospital. She had been home for exactly 17 minutes, just long enough to shower and check on Tommy before attempting to catch a few hours of sleep. Now she knelt beside her son's wheelchair, gathering the fragments of technology that represented his independence, his safety, his peace of mind. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Sarah's voice trembled with exhaustion and fury. "That bracelet monitors Tommy's vital signs. It alerts emergency services when he's in distress. It's not a toy. It's medical equipment." Karen adjusted her yoga outfit, a pristine ensemble that probably cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail so tight it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of disdain. Medical equipment shouldn't make noise in a residential area. This is a family neighborhood, not a hospital. If you can't control your son's devices, perhaps you should consider relocating to a more appropriate environment. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Tommy's small hands gripped the wheels of his chair, his knuckles white with the effort of containing emotions too complex for his years. Sarah stood slowly, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the face of such casual cruelty. "Tommy needs that bracelet," she said, her voice growing steadier with each word. "His condition can cause sudden respiratory issues. Without monitoring, he could—" She stopped herself, unwilling to voice her deepest fears in front of her son. "Not my problem," Karen replied with a dismissive wave. "The HOA regulations clearly state that all electronic devices must be used responsibly. Constant beeping constitutes a noise violation. I'm well within my rights as neighborhood president to enforce community standards." From my own front porch, 3 houses down, I watched this exchange with the kind of cold analytical attention that had served me well in my 20-year career with the city's forensic technology division. Karen Richardson had just made 2 critical errors. First, she had destroyed what appeared to be a medical device in full view of multiple witnesses. Second, she had done so while speaking to someone whose overnight shift suggested medical training, making intent and awareness difficult to dispute in any future legal proceedings. More importantly, she had just committed these acts in front of me. Dr. Marcus Webb, Chief of Forensic Technology for the City Police Department, specializing in the intersection of criminal law and electronic evidence. The irony was not lost on me that someone so concerned with neighborhood regulations had just violated several municipal ordinances, not to mention potential federal laws regarding medical device interference. I set down my morning coffee and began walking toward the confrontation. My 20 years of investigating technology-related crimes had taught me that documentation began with observation, and preservation of evidence started immediately. "Excuse me," I called out as I approached. I couldn't help but notice the commotion. "Is everyone all right?" Karen turned toward me, with the practiced smile she reserved for potential allies. She had seen me around the neighborhood, but had never bothered to learn my name or profession. To her, I was simply another middle-aged man, who might be sympathetic to her cause. "Oh, hello. I'm just handling a small neighborhood issue. Nothing that concerns you, I'm sure." Her voice carried the dismissive tone of someone accustomed to having her version of events accepted without question. I knelt beside the broken device, careful not to disturb the fragments while conducting a preliminary visual assessment. The circuit board was intact, despite the impact damage, and I could see what appeared to be a cellular transmitter module among the components. This wasn't just a simple fitness tracker or toy. The sophistication of the electronics suggested medical-grade monitoring equipment. "Ma'am," I said, addressing Sarah while maintaining my examination of the device, "could you tell me exactly what happened here?" Sarah glanced nervously between Karen and me, clearly uncertain about involving a stranger in what was already a difficult situation. My son's medical alert bracelet was making its normal monitoring sounds, and Mrs. Richardson, she said it was bothering her dog. She asked Tommy to turn it off, but it doesn't work that way. It's automatic monitoring. Then she stomped on it. Tommy spoke for the first time since the incident, his voice small but clear. "It wasn't even that loud. It just beeps sometimes when it checks my heart. Mom says it's keeping me safe." Karen's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features as she perhaps began to realize that the situation might be more serious than she had initially considered. The device was creating a disturbance. As HOA president, I have authority to address noise violations. I offered reasonable solutions, but they were ignored. "What solutions did you offer?" I asked, continuing my documentation of the scene. "I suggested they could turn it off during community quiet hours, or adjust the volume, or perhaps move their activities to a less central location in the neighborhood." Karen's voice carried the confidence of someone who believed bureaucratic authority trumped common sense. Sarah's exhaustion was evident in every line of her body. I tried to explain that it's not optional. It's monitoring Tommy's condition continuously. You can't just turn off someone's pacemaker because it makes noise. "It's not a pacemaker," Karen corrected with exaggerated patience. "It's some kind of electronic gadget. Children don't need to be attached to machines constantly. When I was growing up, we managed just fine without all this technology." The ignorance in that statement was staggering, but what concerned me more was the deliberate destruction of what I was now certain was medical monitoring equipment. I stood, brushing dust from my hands, and looked directly at Karen for the first time. "Mrs. Richardson, I'm going to need you to stay here for a few minutes while I make a phone call. This situation has moved beyond HOA jurisdiction." Something in my tone must have penetrated her confidence, because her expression shifted from annoyance to uncertainty. "I don't see why that's necessary. This is a neighborhood matter. I have authority here." "Your authority extends to community guidelines, not federal medical device regulations," I replied calmly. "I need to verify the classification and legal status of the device you've destroyed." Karen's face flushed slightly. "Are you threatening me? Because I know my rights, and I know the law. I've been studying HOA regulations for years." "I'm sure you have," I said, pulling out my phone. "But HOA regulations don't override municipal, state, or federal law, and destroying medical equipment might fall under several different legal categories." While I made my call to the department to request a forensic evidence kit and backup documentation, I watched Karen's demeanor continue to shift. She was clearly unaccustomed to having her authority questioned, particularly by someone she had dismissed as an unimportant neighbor. Her confidence was beginning to crack around the edges. Tommy had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up again. Is someone going to fix my bracelet? It tells Mom when I need help. The simplicity of his question cut through all the legal and bureaucratic complexity of the situation. This was about a child's safety, not community noise ordinances or HOA authority. Sarah knelt beside his wheelchair and took his hand. We'll get you a new one. Sweetheart, Dr. Martinez will understand. These things happen sometimes. Her voice was gentle, but I could hear the underlying worry. Medical devices were expensive, and insurance companies didn't always replace destroyed equipment quickly. How much does replacement cost? I asked Sarah. The device itself is about $800, but that's not counting the setup fees, programming, and medical consultation required for calibration. Probably close to $1,500 total. And Tommy needs it operational within 48 hours for his safety protocol. Karen had been listening to this exchange with growing discomfort. I didn't realize. It looked like one of those fitness trackers. I wouldn't have, if I had known it was that expensive. The cost isn't the primary issue. I said, the issue is that you destroyed medical equipment belonging to a disabled child. The cost is just one factor that will need to be addressed. My phone call had been brief but productive. The department was sending someone to document the scene and collect evidence. And I had confirmed the device classification through our medical technology database. Tommy's bracelet was indeed registered as Class II medical equipment, making its destruction potentially criminal under several state and federal statutes. Mrs. Richardson, I said, returning my attention to the HOA president. I need to inform you that you're currently the subject of a preliminary investigation into destruction of medical property. I'd recommend you contact an attorney before making any additional statements. The color drained from Karen's face. Investigation? I don't understand. This is a neighborhood dispute. You can't just... Who are you anyway? You don't have authority to investigate anything. I reached into my wallet and produced my identification. Dr. Marcus Webb, Chief of Forensic Technology, City Police Department, and Mrs. Richardson. I have extensive authority to investigate technology-related crimes, particularly those involving medical devices. The transformation in Karen's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The confident HOA president vanished, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand the magnitude of her mistake. She stared at my identification as if it might change if she looked at it long enough. I didn't know, she whispered. I thought you were just... you live in the neighborhood. I didn't think... What you thought isn't relevant to the legal issues you've created, I replied. What matters is your actions and their consequences. You destroyed medical equipment belonging to a disabled child. Your motivations and assumptions don't change those facts. Sarah had been watching this exchange with a mixture of relief and concern. Relief that someone with apparent authority was taking the situation seriously, but concern about the escalating nature of what had started as a neighborhood dispute. Dr. Webb, she said carefully, I appreciate your help, but I don't want this to become bigger than it needs to be. Tommy just needs his bracelet replaced. We don't need anyone to go to jail over this. Her generosity in the face of such casual cruelty was remarkable. But I had seen too many cases where letting seemingly minor offenses slide led to escalating patterns of behavior. Karen Richardson needed to understand that actions had consequences, regardless of her perceived social status or neighborhood authority. Sarah, I understand your position, and your feelings will certainly be considered in any decisions about prosecution. But this isn't just about replacement costs. It's about establishing that destroying medical equipment has serious legal consequences. The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted our conversation. Detective Lisa Chen from our Technology Crimes Unit had arrived with a forensic evidence kit and camera equipment. I had worked with Lisa for over a decade, and she understood the intersection of technology and criminal law better than most judges. "Marcus," she called out as she approached, "what do we have here?" I provided a brief summary of the incident, while Lisa began photographing the scene and collecting the device fragments. Her presence seemed to drive home the seriousness of the situation to Karen, who had grown increasingly pale as the official documentation process began. "Ma'am," Lisa addressed Karen, "I need to inform you that you're being investigated for possible violations of Municipal Ordinance 247.3 destruction of medical property, and, potentially, Federal Statute 21 U.S.C. 301, tampering with medical devices. You have the right to remain silent, and I'd recommend exercising that right until you've consulted with an attorney." Karen's legal troubles were just beginning, but my immediate concern was ensuring Tommy's safety. "Sarah, what's the fastest way to get Tommy a replacement device?" "His pediatric cardiologist can authorize emergency replacement, but the insurance approval process usually takes weeks. We might have to pay out of pocket initially and hope for reimbursement later." The financial strain was evident in her voice. "Mrs. Richardson," I said, turning back to Karen, "you're going to be financially responsible for immediate replacement of the device you destroyed. That includes all associated costs, expedited shipping, emergency medical consultations, and any additional monitoring Tommy requires during the interim period." "I can't afford that kind of expense right now," Karen protested. "My husband's business has been slow, and we have our own medical bills." "You should have considered the financial implications before destroying someone else's medical equipment," Lisa interjected. "Actions have consequences, Mrs. Richardson. Expensive consequences in this case." Over the next hour, the situation developed into a full criminal investigation. Lisa documented everything methodically, photographed the scene from multiple angles, collected witness statements, and gathered the device fragments for forensic analysis. The broken bracelet would be examined for fingerprints, DNA evidence, and impact patterns to corroborate the witness testimony. Tommy had been remarkably patient throughout this process, but I could see the stress beginning to affect him. His breathing had become slightly labored, and Sarah was monitoring him carefully for signs of distress that would normally be caught by his bracelet. "We need to get him inside and resting," Sarah said quietly. "The excitement and stress aren't good for his condition." "Of course," I replied. "Detective Chen has everything she needs from you for now. We'll be in touch about the replacement device and any additional questions." As Sarah began wheeling Tommy toward their house, he looked back at me. "Thank you for helping us. Dr. Webb, will you make sure the mean lady can't break anyone else's medical stuff?" His question was both heartbreaking and profound. This 8-year-old boy understood that the issue extended beyond his broken bracelet to a broader question of community responsibility and protection of vulnerable members. "I'll do everything I can to make sure this doesn't happen again. Tommy, you focus on staying healthy and let the adults handle the legal stuff." After Sarah and Tommy were safely inside, Lisa and I continued our investigation. Karen had finally taken our advice about remaining silent, but her earlier statements had provided plenty of evidence of intent and awareness. She stood nearby, looking increasingly isolated as neighbors began to gather and learn what had happened. Word was spreading quickly through Willowbrook Commons, and the community response was overwhelmingly supportive of the Morrison family. Tommy was a beloved neighborhood fixture, and many residents had been unaware of the severity of his medical condition. The idea that someone would deliberately destroy his medical equipment was generating significant anger and disgust. Mrs. Patricia Chen, an elderly resident who lived next door to the Morrisons, approached our group with obvious distress. "Is it true that Karen destroyed Tommy's medical device? That sweet boy. What kind of person does something like that?" Her question hung in the air, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. What kind of person indeed? Someone so insulated by privilege and perceived authority that they had lost touch with basic human empathy. Someone who prioritized their own minor inconveniences over a child's life-threatening medical needs. Lisa was wrapping up her initial evidence collection when her phone rang. After a brief conversation, she turned to me with a grim expression. That was the prosecutor's office. They want to fast-track this case. Apparently. Tommy's bracelet destruction is the third incident this month involving interference with medical devices in the city. They're looking at a pattern. This information cast Karen's actions in an even more serious light. If prosecutors were seeing a pattern of medical device interference, they might pursue enhanced charges or federal involvement. Karen's legal troubles were expanding beyond a simple neighborhood dispute. "Mrs. Richardson," I called out to Karen, who had been standing silently near her house. "You need to understand that this investigation is expanding. I'd strongly recommend you contact an attorney immediately." She nodded mutely, the fight seemingly gone out of her entirely. The confident HOA president, who had started this morning by destroying a child's medical device, was now facing potential federal charges and community ostracism. The transformation was remarkable and somewhat tragic, though entirely self-inflicted. As Lisa packed up her equipment and prepared to leave, I found myself reflecting on the morning's events. In my career, I had investigated technology crimes ranging from simple theft to complex corporate fraud. But there was something particularly disturbing about this case. The casual cruelty, the complete disregard for a vulnerable child's safety, the abuse of perceived authority. It represented something fundamentally broken in our community structures. Tommy Morrison needed his bracelet not as a luxury or convenience, but as a lifeline. Karen Richardson had destroyed that lifeline because it occasionally made noise during her yoga routine. The disproportion between cause and effect was staggering, and I was determined to ensure that the legal response would be proportional to the harm caused. Over the following days, the investigation expanded rapidly. Lisa's forensic analysis of the device fragments revealed clear evidence of deliberate destruction, including heel marks matching Karen's designer shoes and DNA evidence confirming her direct contact with the device. The fingerprint analysis was equally damning, showing that Karen had handled the bracelet before destroying it, contradicting any potential claims of accidental damage. Meanwhile, Sarah had managed to get Tommy's replacement bracelet expedited through emergency medical channels, but the process had been stressful and expensive. The 48 hours without monitoring had required constant vigilance on Sarah's part, essentially functioning as a human monitoring device for her son's condition. The impact on both mother and child had been significant. The prosecutor's office moved quickly on the case, filing charges under 3 different statutes: municipal charges for destruction of property and creating a public disturbance, state charges for interfering with medical equipment, and federal charges for tampering with regulated medical devices. Karen's simple act of frustration had cascaded into a complex legal nightmare. The first court hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, giving Karen's hastily hired attorney minimal time to prepare a defense. The evidence was overwhelming. The witness testimony was clear and consistent, and the forensic analysis left no room for alternative explanations. Karen's best hope was plea bargaining for reduced charges in exchange for full restitution and community service. The neighborhood reaction continued to evolve as more details emerged about Tommy's condition and the importance of his monitoring device. Residents who had previously supported Karen's strict interpretation of HOA rules began to distance themselves from her actions. The destruction of a disabled child's medical equipment crossed every line of community decency and mutual support. Mrs. Peterson, who lived across the street from the Morrisons, organized a neighborhood fundraiser to help with Tommy's medical expenses and to establish an emergency fund for other families who might face similar situations. The response was overwhelming, with donations pouring in from residents throughout the community and even from neighboring areas who had heard about the incident. The fundraiser served another important purpose beyond financial support. It demonstrated that Karen's actions were not representative of community values, and that Willowbrook Commons would rally around its most vulnerable members when they faced crises. The neighborhood was healing itself through collective action and mutual support. Karen, meanwhile, had become increasingly isolated. Her position as HOA president was under review, with several board members calling for her immediate resignation. Her rigid interpretation of community rules and her apparent lack of empathy for special circumstances had always been controversial. But the destruction of Tommy's bracelet had crystallized widespread dissatisfaction with her leadership. The emergency HOA board meeting was scheduled for the Thursday evening before Karen's court appearance. The agenda included discussion of her continued fitness to serve as president, review of the association's policies regarding medical equipment and accessibility issues, and consideration of formal censure for her actions. The meeting promised to be contentious and potentially decisive for Karen's future in the community. As the chief investigating officer, I wouldn't normally attend such meetings, but Sarah Morrison had specifically requested my presence to provide factual information about the legal proceedings and their implications for community policy. My role would be educational rather than adversarial, helping residents understand the broader legal framework surrounding medical device protection and disability rights. The community center was packed for the emergency meeting, with nearly every household in Willowbrook Commons represented. Tommy was there with his mother, his new bracelet visible on his wrist, monitoring his vital signs and providing the security that Karen had so callously destroyed. The symbolism was powerful and intentional. Karen arrived late, accompanied by her attorney and looking haggard from days of stress and social isolation. She took her usual place at the front of the room, but the dynamic had shifted dramatically. Instead of commanding authority from her position, she appeared diminished and defensive. Board member James Rodriguez opened the meeting with a statement that set the tone for the evening. "We're here tonight to address actions that have brought shame to our community and endangered one of our most vulnerable residents. This isn't about HOA politics or personal disputes. This is about fundamental human decency and our obligations to protect each other." The first order of business was a formal presentation of the facts surrounding Tommy's bracelet destruction. Sarah Morrison spoke quietly but powerfully about her son's condition, his need for constant monitoring, and the impact of Karen's actions on their family. Her presentation was devastating in its simplicity and emotional authenticity. "Tommy doesn't choose to need medical equipment," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her words. "He doesn't choose to have muscular dystrophy, but he does choose to be brave every day, to participate in community activities, to be a regular kid despite his challenges. When someone destroys his medical equipment because it's inconvenient to them, they're not just breaking a device. They're attacking his right to participate safely in our community." Karen's attorney had advised her to remain silent during the meeting, but the weight of community disapproval and her own guilt were clearly affecting her. She sat rigidly in her chair, staring straight ahead, as neighbor after neighbors spoke about Tommy's positive impact on their lives and their disappointment in her actions. When my turn came to address the meeting, I focused on the legal framework and community obligations. Federal and state laws protect medical devices for obvious reasons. They save lives. When we destroy or interfere with these devices, we're not just committing property crimes. We're potentially endangering human life. Communities have both legal and moral obligations to protect their most vulnerable members. The discussion period that followed was intense, but civil. Residents expressed their support for the Morrison family and their disappointment in Karen's leadership. Several people shared stories of their own family members' medical needs and the importance of community understanding and accommodation. Mrs. Chen, the elderly neighbor, spoke with particular eloquence about the nature of community responsibility. We don't live in isolation. We live in community. That means we accept some minor inconveniences for the greater good. A medical device that beeps occasionally isn't a hardship. It's a reminder that we share our space with people who need our consideration and support. The formal motion to remove Karen from her position as HOA president passed by an overwhelming margin, with only 2 dissenting votes. The board also voted to implement new policies specifically protecting residents' rights to use necessary medical equipment without interference or harassment. Karen's destructive action had ironically led to stronger protections for people like Tommy. As the meeting concluded, Karen finally spoke for the first time since the incident had escalated. "I want to apologize to Tommy and his mother. I made a terrible mistake, and I'm going to do everything I can to make it right." Her words seemed genuine, though they came far too late to prevent the legal consequences of her actions. The court proceedings the following Tuesday were swift and decisive. Karen's attorney had negotiated a plea agreement that included full restitution for Tommy's medical expenses, substantial community service focused on disability advocacy, and mandatory education about medical device regulations. She would avoid jail time, but her actions would have lasting financial and personal consequences. Judge Maria Santos addressed Karen directly during the sentencing hearing. "Mrs. Richardson, your actions represent a fundamental failure of community citizenship. You targeted a disabled child and destroyed equipment critical to his health and safety. This court will not tolerate such behavior, regardless of your motivations or social position." The judge also ordered Karen to write a formal letter of apology to Tommy and to participate in a public education campaign about disability rights and medical device protection. Her case would be used as an example in community education programs throughout the city. In the months that followed, Willowbrook Commons underwent a remarkable transformation. The incident had forced residents to examine their own assumptions about community obligations and mutual support. New initiatives emerged to help families with medical needs, and the neighborhood became a model for inclusive community design. Tommy's story had touched people throughout the city, and he became an inadvertent spokesperson for children with disabilities. His quiet courage and resilience in the face of Karen's cruelty had inspired many people to become more aware of accessibility issues and more supportive of inclusive policies. Sarah Morrison was promoted to head nurse of the pediatric unit at the Children's Hospital, partially as a result of the community recognition that emerged from the incident. Her advocacy for her son had demonstrated leadership qualities that her supervisors had not previously recognized. Karen Richardson eventually fulfilled her community service obligations and participated in the required education programs. But she never regained her position of influence in the neighborhood. She and her family eventually moved away from Willowbrook Commons, unable to overcome the social consequences of her actions. The case became something of a landmark in medical device protection law, cited in subsequent prosecutions and legislative debates about community obligations to protect disabled residents. My department developed new training protocols based on the investigation, helping other jurisdictions understand the legal frameworks surrounding medical device interference. Looking back on the incident, I'm struck by how quickly a single moment of thoughtless cruelty cascaded into life-changing consequences for everyone involved. Karen's decision to destroy Tommy's bracelet took perhaps 30 seconds, but the investigation, prosecution, and community healing process stretched over many months. The morning I watched Karen Richardson raise her heel and destroy a disabled child's medical device, I was witnessing more than simple vandalism. I was seeing the intersection of privilege, ignorance, and casual cruelty that can devastate vulnerable community members when left unchecked. The legal response was necessary and appropriate, but the community response was equally important in establishing new norms of mutual support and protection. Tommy Morrison continues to wear his medical alert bracelet, monitoring his condition and providing security for both him and his mother. The device beeps occasionally during his daily activities, just as it always has. But now those beeps serve as a reminder to the entire community of our obligations to protect and support our most vulnerable neighbors. The emergency bracelet incident taught us all that community standards must include protection for people with special needs. That authority comes with responsibility for others' welfare, and that actions have consequences regardless of social position or perceived justification. These are lessons that extend far beyond HOA regulations or neighborhood disputes. They're lessons about fundamental human decency and the kind of community we choose to create together. In the end, Karen Richardson's moment of destructive impulse had created something positive. Though not in any way she could have intended. Tommy Morrison was safer, the community was stronger, and future families with special needs would find greater understanding and support in Willowbrook Commons. Justice had been served, both legally and socially, and the neighborhood had learned to be better protectors of its most vulnerable members. Sometimes the most important cases aren't the complex fraud investigations or high-tech cybercrimes that fill most of my professional time. Sometimes they're the simple moments when someone with authority decides that their minor convenience matters more than another person's fundamental safety. Those moments test everything we claim to believe about community, justice, and human dignity. The broken medical bracelet lying on that sidewalk had represented much more than damaged electronics. It had represented a broken promise of community protection, a failure of empathy, and a moment when someone with power chose to use it destructively rather than constructively. The investigation and prosecution that followed had been about more than legal accountability. They had been about rebuilding that promise and ensuring it would be kept in the future. As I filed the final paperwork on the case, I realized that some of the most important work we do in law enforcement isn't about catching sophisticated criminals or solving complex mysteries. It's about standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves, protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit or harm them, and ensuring that justice reaches every corner of our communities, even the quiet suburban neighborhoods where people assume they're safe from such concerns. Tommy Morrison deserved to live safely in his community, protected by neighbors who understood his needs and supported his participation in everyday life. Karen Richardson had threatened that safety through her destructive actions, but the community response had ultimately strengthened it. That's perhaps the most positive outcome we could have hoped for from such a troubling incident. The case files now sit in our department archives, available for training purposes and legal reference. But the real legacy of the emergency bracelet incident lives in the changed community it left behind. Willowbrook Commons became a place where medical needs were understood and accommodated, where vulnerable residents were protected rather than targeted, and where authority was exercised responsibly rather than selfishly. Those are the kinds of changes that make law enforcement work worthwhile, even when they emerge from the most troubling circumstances. Justice isn't always about punishment. though accountability is certainly important. Sometimes justice is about transformation, healing, and building stronger communities that protect all their members. The morning Karen Richardson destroyed Tommy Morrison's emergency bracelet had started like any other day in our quiet neighborhood. It ended with all of us understanding our responsibilities to each other more clearly, and with one little boy's safety better protected than it had ever been before. In the balance of justice, that outcome made all the investigation, prosecution, and community upheaval worthwhile.